It was early in the morning. The air was cold, but the sun was peeking through. The sunlight reflecting off the car's windshield was blinding, but I didn't care. Behind the wheel with an old jazz melody playing softly on the radio, I found myself wondering who I might run into at the end of the road ahead. We were on our way to a funeral. An old friend of ours, my father's close companion, a retired soldier. He had passed away at the age of 83. Maybe it was an emotional day for us, but a corner of my heart felt completely empty because someone wasn't on my mind. I hadn't even thought of him. My uncle, Daniel. In the back seat, my mother sat in silence. My brother Harry, sitting next to me, was glued to his phone. No one was talking. Maybe silence is normal on the way to a funeral, but this silence felt different. It was as if everyone was there only because they had to be, as if we had all frozen our emotions inside. When we arrived at the church, people were seated quietly. I didn't recognize most of them, but a few in military uniform immediately caught my eye. This country never forgets its veterans, or at least that's what they say. But some are chosen to be forgotten. Some are deliberately erased from history. In the middle of the ceremony, I noticed someone entering through the side corridor of the church. Tall, lean. He wore a worn-out trench coat. His head was slightly bowed, but his face was visible. His eyes were different. His face was familiar, but aged, tired, but alive. As my gaze locked onto him, my mother suddenly gasped. She trembled slightly, her eyes widened. She whispered, "Is that Daniel?" And in that moment, my knees nearly buckled. Because in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a funeral. For us, this was a resurrection. It took me a moment to grasp the reality of that moment. The entire room felt frozen. Inside the church, amidst the praying crowd, the silence suddenly grew heavier. That man standing there had his eyes locked directly on me. It was as if in that entire crowd, he could only see me. His face was pale. The skin under his eyes had sunken, his hair had turned gray, and his beard was thin and trembling. But those eyes, I could never forget those eyes. They were the same eyes of the uncle who taught me how to ride a bike as a kid, who used to sneak me chocolate on Sunday mornings. It was Daniel, the man we believed to have died in the war 29 years ago, the man we had held a funeral for. He was standing right there, and he was looking at me. I turned my head and looked at my mother. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she wasn't crying. Harry still hadn't noticed, still glued to his screen. I opened my mouth to say something to them, but the words drowned in the breath I swallowed. All I could do was stand up, slowly, hoping no one would notice. And then I walked toward that man. My knees were trembling. My heart was pounding so hard it barely fit inside my chest. With every step, my mind screamed that this couldn't be real. This was a mistake, a look-alike, some cruel trick. But my heart said otherwise. It was him. It was Uncle Daniel. When I reached him, he never looked away. There was a subtle tremble on his lips. I moved closer, less than a meter away now. I could almost smell him. Sweat and old tobacco. Familiar. As if no time had passed at all. "Uncle," I said, my voice cracking. "Is it really you?" He smiled, just a small smile. Then he lowered his head. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" he said. His voice was rough, like words had been gathering dust in his throat for years. My eyes filled with tears. I swallowed hard. "We thought you were dead." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I thought so too," he said. "But I didn't die. I was just sent somewhere too far to come back from." And in that moment, I began to understand. This wasn't just a reunion. This was the first sentence of a silence that lasted for years. And for the first time in my life, I saw the past and the future shining in someone's eyes at the very same time. We walked out of the church corridor together. Neither of us spoke, and he didn't rush. It was as if we had left time behind years ago. By the time we reached the garden, the sun was beginning to set. The breeze was cool, but on our skin, it carried the weight of the past. Daniel had his hands in his pockets, his head slightly bowed. His posture was far from the confident, cheerful man I remembered. In his place now stood someone weary, fragile, and perhaps still too afraid to speak the whole truth. We found a stone bench to sit on. Daniel sat down slowly. "That day," he said, The day of our final mission, they told us it was just reconnaissance. We went out lightly equipped. But what waited for us there wasn't just an ambush. It was silence. Our radio went dead. The maps were wrong. I knew then we wouldn't be coming back. He fell silent, took a deep breath, clasped his hands together. I just listened. There was so much he had to tell, and the weight of it all was heavier than words. Two of us survived, he said, me and one other. I lost him. Then they took me. I still don't know who they were. People whose language I didn't speak, orders I didn't understand. They took my ID, changed my clothes, and then left me in another life. His eyes drifted to the horizon. At first I wanted to escape every morning, but then I stayed so long my old life started to feel like a dream. My family, you, Mom, even my name. I forgot it for a while. They gave me a new name, a new mission, a new identity. I swallowed hard. Something in me tightened. Why now? I asked. Why after all these years? Daniel looked at me. For the first time, there was something clear in his eyes. Regret. One day I found a piece of paper, he said. It had a photo of me as a child. Someone who knew me must have taken it long ago in secret. I found it in a box. And in that moment, everything came back. Your voices, Mom's laughter, your childhood. Silence settled again. But now that silence didn't feel foreign. I didn't die, he said, but I can't say I truly lived either. Because a person only really exists once they return to where they belong. And in that moment I realized I wasn't sitting with a ghost. I was sitting with a man who had been lost. And maybe what brought him back wasn't an unburied farewell, but a sense of belonging that had never been forgotten. As I walked home with Daniel, leaving behind that stone bench, there was a storm inside me. With every step, a memory surfaced from my mind, only to be replaced by something he had told me. By the time we arrived home, my mother was still inside, sitting on the couch. In her hands was an old photo frame, holding a memory untouched, even by time. The last photo taken of Daniel in uniform. It was supposed to be the last time we ever saw him, or so we thought. When the door opened, she lifted her head. At first, she didn't recognize him, but then a flush of color spread across her face. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked like she wanted to stand, but instead, only one word left her lips. Daniel. In that moment, the silence hit the room like a slap. Daniel's steps trembled as he walked toward her. There were only a few paces between them, yet it felt like a thick wall of years still stood in the way. Then slowly she raised her hand. She placed her palm on Daniel's cheek. That touch was a mother's love continuing from where it had been interrupted years ago. We buried you, son, she said, her voice trembling but clear. We even placed your stone, etched your name, and I prayed every day at that stone. Daniel lowered his gaze. I prayed every night too, he said, to one day be able to stand in front of that stone. But without knowing it, I lived in its shadow for years, by the wall of a street, in the corner of a station, with no identity. I didn't even have a place in this world, not even like that stone. My father stood in the doorway, silently watching. His face was stern, but his eyes now said something else, not resistance, but acceptance. My mother held Daniel's hands. Let that stone remain, she said, but now you stay here too, because we didn't lose you when we buried you. We lost you when we started to forget. That night we had dinner together. Amid the clinking of cutlery, a silent bond formed. Everyone wanted to ask something, but no one rushed. Because even a single word from Daniel was enough to fill the space-time had hollowed out. That night, for the first time, Daniel slept in his own room, in a real bed. And we realized that sometimes a gravestone doesn't mark a lifeless body. It holds a silence that's still breathing. But even if someone's name has been erased, they continue to live, wherever they are remembered. That night, no one in the house could sleep easily. The silence wasn't like a familiar guest. It was more like the past barging through the door. Everyone was in their own room, but our thoughts circled the same place, Daniel. He was no longer just someone we had lost. He had become a mystery. While time had stood still for us, for him, the years had passed to a different rhythm, within a different reality. In the morning, the house was still. The only sound was the faint whistle of the kettle from the kitchen. My mother had woken early and gone there. She stood by the window, staring out, holding her cup like she had forgotten it was in her hand. When I approached, she noticed me. Her face still carried the weariness of the night before. "I've had the same dream for years," she said. "Daniel walks through the door. I warm him some soup, but he never sits down. Every time he just turns and leaves." She took a sip from her tea. "This morning, for the first time, I didn't wake from that dream. He was really in the kitchen. He really asked for soup." Just then we heard a door open gently from Daniel's room. Light, careful footsteps entered the living room. The shirt he wore wasn't his. It belonged to my father from years ago. But the way he wore it made it his. His gaze was still tired, but there was peace on his face. He looked at my mother, then at me, and he smiled. "I'm not dreaming, am I?" he asked. My mother stood. "No, son," she said. "Not anymore." That day, we had breakfast together. For the first time, the three of us sat at the same table. My father joined us too. At first, the conversations were cautious, but slowly the ice began to melt. Daniel didn't explain exactly where he had been, but what he did say was enough. There had been a time when he couldn't remember who he was, then slowly, fragments started returning, and he was afraid. Afraid that if he ever tried to return, there might be no place left for him. My father put down his fork and turned to him. "You always had a place," he said. "We just stopped looking at the empty chair." Daniel lowered his head. 2 tears slid down his cheeks. He tried to wipe them quickly, but my mother held his hand. "Let them fall, son," she said softly. "Let all those years pour out like water from a full glass." And that day, for the first time, 4 people sat around that table. But one more soul joined our hearts. It was Daniel, truly returned, truly staying, and finally, truly home. After breakfast, everyone quietly retreated to their own corner. Daniel stood by the window, staring outside. I didn't know what he was seeing, but it was clearly more than what we could. Maybe he was watching a past we had forgotten how to look at. He held his teacup in his hand, but never drank from it. He was holding on to it, as if it was something to hold on to. My mother went to the kitchen and began washing the dishes in silence. My father stepped out onto the veranda. Out of old habit, he folded his hands in the air as if he were holding a morning newspaper. But then he just stared into the emptiness. I stayed beside Daniel. We had so many questions for him, but the only one echoing inside all of us was, "Why now?" And yet, no one asked it. Without taking his eyes off the window, Daniel spoke. "What's changed since I've been gone?" The weight of that question was enough to crush the room. Someone had to answer, but what words could possibly explain all that had been lost? From the veranda, my father called in. "They cut down the peach tree in the yard. It kept toppling in the storms." Daniel nodded. "I built a swing on that tree," he said. "With you," he added, turning to me. He remembered. He hadn't forgotten. But clearly, remembering didn't mean he was still living in those moments. My mother looked at him while drying her hands. "Are you going to the Alibd again?" she asked. In that moment, time froze. It was perhaps the question we most wanted to ask, but the one we were least brave enough to say. Daniel lowered his head. He didn't answer right away. We tried to understand through the silence. Then he slowly walked into the kitchen. He stood across from my mother. His eyes were wet. "I don't want to go anywhere anymore," he said softly. "But sometimes, in order to stay, you have to be forgiven first." My mother stepped forward. She touched his cheek with her fingers. "We never blamed you," she said. "We just had to learn how to live without you." I turned my head away, because in that moment, it was impossible not to cry. We never asked Daniel why he came back, because deep down we already knew the answer. No matter how lost a person may be, they always carry the name of where they belong in their heart. And for Daniel, that place had always been this home. With Daniel's return, time inside the house began to slow down. Hours passed, but the days felt like they stood still. He was always there, sitting in the same chair, looking out the same window, drinking the same tea. And yet, we still weren't sure if he had truly come back. His body was here, yes, but his soul seemed to be standing guard on some distant border. The furniture remained untouched. The rugs were the same, the photos still hung on the walls, The lace tablecloth my mother had crocheted still lay neatly on the table. And yet, the most unfamiliar presence in all that familiarity was Daniel. He sat with us, but his eyes were somewhere else, as if he were having conversations with people who weren't in the room. One morning, my father left a small box in his room. On the lid, it read, "What we collected while you were gone." Daniel opened it slowly. Inside were childhood photos, an old toy car, and letters my mother had written but never sent. He picked up one and read it in silence. Then, in the corner of a notebook with a trembling hand, he wrote a few words. "I thought of you too, every single day." At night, we sat together in the living room, but our conversations always felt incomplete. Every sentence carried a quiet but. Every answer came with a hesitant maybe. We all knew there were things Daniel hadn't told us, but we weren't sure if he even had the right words to share them. Sometimes speaking about what you've lived through doesn't ease the pain. It only makes it burn deeper. One night, Daniel fell asleep by the window with the quilt my mother had knitted draped over him. I quietly laid a blanket over his shoulders. I looked at his face. He was in a deep sleep, but the lines carved into his skin told stories of years past. Each one seemed like the echo of a silent scream. And that's when I understood. This house had waited for him to return. But now we had to prepare for him to stay. Because not all wars are fought with weapons. Sometimes coming home is a war in itself. And there we were in the heart of that battle, trying to rebuild a life we thought we'd lost long ago, but nothing was the same anymore. Because someone who's been lost can return. But when they do, everyone has changed, just a little. Days at home began to blur into one another. Daniel would wake up early, walk around the yard, and sit in silence for long stretches. Our conversations were still brief, cautious, and only scratched the surface. One morning, as I was making tea, my mother turned from the window and quietly said, "He doesn't feel like he belongs anywhere. But what he needs most is right inside this house." That day, I suggested we visit the old lakeside spot we used to go to as kids. At first, he said nothing, just nodded slightly. But when I saw him in the afternoon, coat on, standing by the front door, a flicker of hope stirred in me. We got in the car. I turned on the radio, but no one spoke. There were walls in that silence, walls he'd spent years building. When we arrived, the wind was pushing the water gently toward the shore. A faint hum rose through the reeds. Daniel started walking. Each step felt like he was searching for a fragment of the past. He stopped when he saw the old wooden dock. "We used to jump off that," he said suddenly. "We raced, and I remember learning to hold my breath when I hit the water." He smiled slightly. "That's what I did the most during the war. I held my breath." Then he fell silent. His hands slipped into his coat pockets. He stared off across the lake. "While I was over there, I thought of this place all the time," he said. "But when I came back, this was what I feared most, that everything would still be exactly the same, or that nothing would be left at all." I didn't know what to say. I just sat beside him. We both stared out over the water. Years had passed, yet the lake was unchanged. Maybe what Daniel couldn't face wasn't the memories themselves, but seeing them still standing, exactly where he'd left them. On the way home, he was quieter but not silent. I left the radio on. At one point, he softly hummed along to a song. Slow, steady, deliberate. That small murmur might have been the first victory in the quiet war he was fighting inside himself. And that day, I understood something. Sometimes the place we fear the most is the one we belong to the deepest. And some memories don't hurt us. They simply call us back to where we were always meant to return. The day we spent by the lake changed the atmosphere in the house. There was still silence. Yes, but now it wasn't like a wall. It was more like the quiet of someone who simply needed to rest. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. He was the first to come to breakfast. My mother was surprised but said nothing. She simply placed an extra slice of bread on his plate. My father kept his head down, stirring something on his plate with his fork. That day, we all went shopping together. Daniel didn't say much, but he walked with us now. He looked around, occasionally made small comments, sometimes stopped to study an item as if it held some long-lost memory. At one point, we visited an old bookstore. He wandered off between the dusty shelves. After a while, I found him standing in front of the military history section. He was holding a book in his hands, flipping through the pages, not reading exactly, but as if searching for a voice hidden in time. "Someone gave me this while I was in the army," he said. "I read it for 3 nights straight. Then there was an explosion. The book was gone. And so was that man." He swallowed hard. "But now, here it is again." In that moment, I realized that the past doesn't always stay behind us. Sometimes it goes ahead and waits. Because what Daniel found on that shelf wasn't just a book or a memory, it was a direction. On the drive home, the radio was on again. This time, Daniel remembered the chorus of a song. He sang it softly. My mother smiled as she looked out the window. My father glanced into the rearview mirror. No one said a word, but everyone heard it. Everyone felt it. That night, Daniel went out into the yard. He carried a chair and placed it beneath the tree. I followed him. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Waiting us out," he said. "For what?" "For myself." I quietly sat next to him. The sky was filled with stars, and in the middle of that night, for the first time, there was something in Daniel's face that looked like peace. And in that moment, I understood. Sometimes we think we've left the past behind, but in truth, it's always a few steps ahead. And only when we're brave enough do we finally catch up to it. That evening, while Daniel sat alone in the garden, the inside of the house seemed to echo his silence. My mother sat at the kitchen table, hands folded in front of her, staring quietly out the window. My father sat in the living room, a newspaper opened in front of him, but he hadn't turned a single page for hours. I was in my room, looking again at the old notebook Daniel had left behind. On the last page, only a few words were written. "If I ever return, I'll have to explain the silence." That sentence kept circling in my mind when Daniel finally came inside. He had been outside for hours, yet his face wasn't numb or sorrowful. On the contrary, it seemed to carry a quiet kind of peace. He entered the living room and looked each of us in the eye. Then, for the first time, my father stood up on his own. He approached Daniel and spoke, not with anger, not with pride, but with calm sincerity. "Tomorrow, if you're willing, we can go to the cemetery." Daniel looked straight at him. "To the grave with my name on it?" he asked. My father nodded. "Let's remove that stone, because no one lies there anymore." At that moment, my mother stood up too. She placed a gentle hand on Daniel's arm. "We need to go there together," she said, "because this won't be just a farewell to the dead. It will be a letting go of the past." The next morning, we went to the cemetery. We stood before the stone that carried Daniel's name. My mother prayed. My father knelt beside it, murmuring something only he could hear. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a small photograph, one from Daniel's youth, the same one my mother had kept folded in her wallet for decades. We tucked it beneath the stone. Daniel didn't say a word, but his eyes were full. And finally, he spoke just one sentence. "This isn't my grave, but this is where I was born again." On the way back, no one spoke. The radio stayed off. We listened to the silence. Because this silence no longer felt empty, it meant something now. And that day, I finally understood. Sometimes stories don't end with loud goodbyes. They end with long silences, because the real answers live in what remains unspoken.